Good evening, everybody, and welcome to CDE Virtual. My guest tonight is Andrés Velasco, Professor of Public Policy and Dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. I first met Andrés when he came to South Africa as a member of Ricardo Hausman's team of experts to work with the government in the 2000s. He stood out for me as a former finance minister of Chile and later presidential candidate who was committed to democracy and had that unusual combination of a real expertise in finance as well as a feel for politics. Andrés, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's a great
Thank you, Anne. Delighted to be here, and thanks for that very kind and generous introduction.
Well, everyone has seen your impressive CV, so I'm going to jump right into our discussion. Chile is a country far away from South Africa, but your personal story of the dictatorship and its impact on you and your family will have a lot of resonance for South Africans. So please, can you briefly tell us about Chile, the dictatorship, exile, and building democracy with a pencil?
Thank you very much, Anne. You're absolutely right. There are two countries that are far apart, although we're both in the Southern Hemisphere. We all understand that Christmas is in the summer, not in the winter, which English friends find puzzling. But there are lots of similarities. We went through a long and very difficult period of authoritarian rule in which many people, including my family, were sent into exile, were persecuted, were killed. And then we had transitions to democracy at about the same time. And even those transitions looked a little bit alike in the sense that there was one broad governing coalition or party, which included lots of different political sensibilities, call it that, and which governed for a long time. But of course, when you govern for a long time, then you tend to get into trouble, as it happened in Chile and also in South Africa. In my personal case, I grew up in Chile. My father was also a dean and a law professor, so it runs in the family. And he was a centrist. He had been very heavily involved with the Social Democratic Party of Chile. And as a lawyer, a few months into the dictatorship that began, as you will remember, 1973, people began walking into his office saying, "My father disappeared last night. They dragged him away. A police group or an army patrol came and we haven't seen him since. Can you help us find him?" So he went from being more of a corporate lawyer type to being a human rights advocate overnight, and became very, very active in the effort to, not to put an end, because that would have been too ambitious, but at least to bring out into the open the massive human rights violations that Pinochet and his henchmen were carrying out at the time. And that caused my father and our family exile. One good day, he found himself put on a plane and shipped out. And we all ended up first in Venezuela, the democratic Venezuela of 30 or 40 years ago, of course, not the dictatorship of today. And then in the United States. And I was lucky enough to have been educated in the US. And I suppose, we're all to some extent the product of our particular historical circumstance. I think of myself as a person whose priorities, whose sense of the important, whose interests were very much shaped by what I saw as a young boy or a young man growing up in Chile. And perhaps one way of summarizing that is the desire to understand why did it happen, and the conviction that it should not happen again. And I think lots of people of my generation have been very much moved by that. And of course, the final chapter, at least in that particular story, is that many of us came back to Chile in the late 80s as democracy was beginning to take root. You may remember that there was a referendum, and that referendum. Unusually, the democratic forces were able to beat the dictator in the referendum, and unusually, the dictator dragged his feet a little bit, but did leave. And I think one reason, not the only one, but one reason why we were able to succeed in that referendum was that lots of young people, educated in Mexico, in England, in France, in Germany, in the US, in all kinds of places, came back and brought their talents to the campaign. And it was a very moving campaign, and a campaign that managed to, get people to put aside their fears and get up, line up on a very sunny day, and then vote against the dictator. That was a long time ago. Chile is in the midst of another, difficult process to reconstruct its democracy. But I suspect you'll ask me about that later.
Great, thank you. Well, you've said that there's nothing more progressive than a sound fiscal policy, and that when a country is fiscally irresponsible, it's not the rich who suffer, but the poor. Can you explain the impact of rising debt and inflation on the poor to us?
Well, actually, that follows quite naturally from what I said a minute ago, namely that we're all the product of our historical circumstance. If you grew up in the Latin America of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was one big debt, inflation, and financial crisis after the other. Of course, the world has had many since. We had the great financial crisis of 12 years ago. We had the COVID crisis. But, there are two regions of the world where Latin America has the original intellectual property rights: populism and financial crises. We are very good at financial crises. And of course, financial crises come in all shapes and forms, but the most prevalent, the most common of those is the story of a country that lives within its means, of a government that borrows too much, a government that is not willing to tax in sufficient amounts to cover expenditures, which attempts to do a bit of a bold move and pays for long-term expenditures with very volatile resources from commodities or some kind of a commodity boom. And then, of course, at some point, sooner or later, it all goes sour. And when it all goes sour, the government defaults. Or if the government doesn't default, the government is forced to cut back precisely on those services, pensions, hospitals, schools, which the poor use most readily and most commonly. And as inflation rises and as the currency devalues, well, it is people who go to supermarkets who take the hit. The rich typically had financial advisors and consultants who could see this coming. And at the right time, they took their money and they put it in Switzerland, or they put it in London, or they put it, in the case of Latin America, in Miami. So the rich, of course, lament this, but they don't really take a very big hit. It is the people whose purchasing power suffers massively that suffer the most. And as in the next stage, the central bank and the government try to bring inflation under control. What do? They bring up interest rates. The economy slows down sharply, and the middle class and the poor take a second hit. First, they had a big hit coming from the loss of purchasing power, the inability to buy as much as they used to with their salary. And then, of course, many of them lose their jobs as the government and the central bank trying to bring the economy back in control. So it's a sequence of shocks which are particularly painful for the middle class. It is particularly painful for small and medium enterprises that also typically borrow during the boom and then have to default or have difficulty paying back during the crisis. And the unemployment and the debt that come into being during these crises can have very long-lasting consequences. Small companies end up carrying on their backs a big bag of debt, which hinders their ability to invest and hire and grow in the future. People, especially people who are 40 or above, who lose their jobs and are outside the labor market for a year or 2 or 3, often find it very difficult to go back and get reinserted into the labor market, find good quality jobs again. So not only is it painful in the short run, it has lasting and painful consequences. And I think one big question today is whether, after all the big fiscal expenditures around the world associated with COVID, might it not be that we are at the doorstep of yet another debt crisis? That's a separate question, but it is one that I'll be happy to put on the table, because I think as we look back on the experience of previous fiscal crises in emerging markets like Chile, like South Africa, like Brazil, like Turkey, Indonesia, sort of the middle-income countries of the world, it is not at all inconceivable that as we look into the next 2 or 3 years, something like that could happen again.
Let me ask you a slightly different angle on this, which is very pertinent to South Africa, and your experience in Latin America will be really relevant. You've argued that a stronger fiscal position can help a country grow. And I suppose the opposite is a weak fiscal position really hampers growth. Can you talk a bit more about that and how this works exactly?
Of course. This has been a subject heavily debated in the US. And in a rich country with very high debt carrying capacity, the arguments are more subtle and more easy to contest. In middle-income countries like South Africa or like Chile, I think the story is quite straightforward and quite simple. If you have a lot of debt, you bring two potential brakes on private investment and economic growth. The first one is high interest rates, higher than they would have to be otherwise. If you have debt that is 80 or 100 or 120% of GDP, the world is going to charge a premium to anybody who's a resident of that country when it comes to lending. And as a result, not only will the government be forced to pay a higher interest rate, companies will be faced with the same reality. And that means that they will invest less, they will hire less, they will train fewer workers, they will accumulate less human capital, and growth will be slower. The other difficulty has to do with government's ability to spend on things that are growth related. If you have a lot of public debt and are being charged high interest rates, well, do the mathematics. Suppose that debt is 100% of GDP, and suppose that you pay 5% in interest, you're paying 5 points of GDP right away in interest. And those are 5 points of GDP you're not devoting to research and development, universities, infrastructure, bridges and ports and airports. And that also means that eventually that acts as a brake on growth. In fact, not eventually, right away. And the combination of those two things, on the one hand, high interest rates, high uncertainty, and on the other hand, a weak ability to provide public goods that lead to private investment and growth. We see that everywhere. Going beyond South Africa and Chile, I think a poster child of this is Brazil. Brazil is a country with extraordinary potential, a quite sophisticated financial market, a very sophisticated industrial structure. Brazil produces electronics and machinery and jets. However, Brazil has public debt of about 85% of GDP. For the last 3 decades, it has had the highest interest rates anywhere in the world. And at the first tremor, we've seen that in the last few months, interest rates come back up, and they come back up more quickly and more sharply than they do elsewhere in Latin America. And because of the very heavy weight of interest rates, and also because of a very heavy weight of pensions in the overall budget, it means that Brazil spends very little on research and development. Brazil spends very little on infrastructure. And as a result, in spite of the tremendous potential, Brazil grows very little. I'll give you one example and I'll end. Brazil is by far the country in the world with the lowest cost sugar production. It is an amazing producer of sugar, and all the machinery used to produce Brazilian sugar is also made in Brazil. What's the only problem? It is grown typically pretty far away from the ocean. And often enough, the real cost associated with selling Brazilian sugar abroad is not the production itself. It's the cost of getting the sugar from the middle of South America, thousands of miles away from the coast, to a ship where you can send it to China or to the US or to Europe. So the lack of adequate infrastructure, whether that be railways or ports or highways, holds back Brazilian growth. And it is hard not to understand that problem in the context of what is a very, very mistaken fiscal approach.
Unfortunately, very familiar to South Africans. Now, South Africa is in the grip of a debate about a basic income grant and whether we can afford it as a society. Some people argue that the South African Reserve Bank should just print money to pay for it. So we're pretty highly taxed, so we can't tax. They argue, let's just print money to pay for it. And they justify this position on this theory called modern monetary theory. Now, you've argued that MMT, as it's called, I like this quote from you, is pithy, it's spiffy, it's snazzy, and it's wrong. That it's mostly mumbo jumbo and a big conceptual mess. What in simple terms is your understanding of this heterodox theory, and why are you so convinced that it's wrong?
I have spent the last 40 or 45 years as a monetary economist, not all of that time in academia, but thinking about these issues very, very often. And I have no doubt whatsoever that it is wrong. It is wrong as a general proposition on how we can finance government expenditure. Yes, it is true that for low inflation rates and smallish expenditures, you can in fact finance those via what we economists call an inflation tax. You issue money, citizens of your country want to hold that money, either because it's good for transactions or because it is good as a store of value or because you can pay taxes in it. And of course, given that they hold your money and producing money is cheap, that is a source of income to the government. So yes, in every country of the world, a point or two of expenditure, maybe less, is financed by the issuance of money. The big mistake, conceptual and empirical, is to go from that very limited use of money as one more source of government finance and simply leap to the conclusion that any expenditure of any size can be financed by money creation. That is just plain wrong. And if someone or if some country or some continent knows about that, that is Latin America. We have tried it a million times. Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Venezuela, Peru, Chile. Believe me, we have tried it. It does not work. And it does not work for a reason that should be fairly evident. You print that money, South African rands, Brazilian reais, Chilean pesos, you give it to your citizens, and it works as long as your citizens want to hold that money. And if you're not printing too much of it, and if that money does not depreciate over time, because the rate of inflation is low, and if there's confidence in the government and the central bank, all is well. But once you try to, spend 4, 5, 6, 10 points of GDP and finance that through money creation, what simply happens is that you print rands or you print pesos or you print reais, which people do not want to hold. They do not want to hold them because there are too many. You have nothing to do with them. Secondly, because once they are too many, people begin trying to give their pesos or rands to the guy next door. And that means that when there are a lot of sellers and not many buyers, that currency loses value. And as it loses value, it becomes less attractive as a store of value. There's uncertainty about the future associated with holding the local currency. And sooner rather than later, you end up in a currency crisis, an inflation crisis, a balance of payments crisis, or all the above put together. Believe me, this is not an intellectual conjecture. This is not some academic paper that some enlightened economist wrote. This is the experience of many middle-income countries over the last 100 years. MMT sounds good. It is intellectual rubbish.
What do you say to people who argue that if we give the poor, money, cash, in the form of a basic income grant, you will actually promote growth sufficient to then pay the fiscus back for that money? How do you see that argument?
That is exactly the same argument that Ronald Reagan, a conservative Republican, deployed in the United States back in the 80s. He said, let us lower taxes on the rich, and the rich will be so grateful that they will invest so much and the economy will grow so much that in fact the revenues that the government gets will rise. That turned out to be wrong. And it turned out to be wrong for exactly the same reasons that MMT is wrong. I don't want to get into technicalities, but certain elasticities have to be of a certain size, and that is simply implausible. That is simply not the case out there in the real world. Now, let me deviate slightly from your financing question to go back to the question of, does one want to have some sort of a transfer scheme to low-income people? And I think the answer is yes. So I would separate the nature of the transfer scheme from the financing of the transfer scheme. If anybody in South Africa thinks that you will be able to give everybody in the country a basic income and you will be able to finance that through money creation, that is fantasy. That is Disneyland. That, as the Americans say, ain't going to happen. A very different question is whether one might have a well-designed, targeted, and affordable program of transfers to low-income workers. And I think the answer is that is desirable. But of course, the devil is in the details. How do you make it targeted and how do you make it affordable? My personal preference, and South Africa has experimented a little bit with this, the UK has too, Chile has too, is to make these targets contingent and not uncontingent. And what I mean by that is to make them as subsidies to employment. The real problem in countries like South Africa and Chile, which have low employment rates, or lots of people outside the labor force, and have lots of unskilled workers who are not necessarily an obvious choice for a firm looking to hire. Well, you want to make labor supply more appealing. You want, to make it more appealing to people to jump in a bus and, ride on that bus for an hour to get to work, or sometimes 2 hours. And you want to make it more appealing for that company to hire a young man without any training or work experience and train that young man or young woman for a lasting high quality job. You can accomplish that by subsidizing labor supply. The way you do that, for instance, is the way we did it in Chile, and I'm sure some variation of this might work in South Africa. You say to workers, if you go to work and you take a formal job tomorrow, somewhere between 10 and 20% of that cash will not end up in your pocket. It will go into Social Security contributions and health contributions. Well, as you join the labor force, the government for the first 3 years will pay that so that you will get 20% more of an income than you would have otherwise. As long, and this is the big catch, as long as the job is formal, as long as the job has a contract, benefits, unemployment insurance, health benefits, et cetera, et cetera. And on the side of the employer, you say, look, there are all these people out there without jobs. Maybe at the current level of the minimum wage, it is not appealing to hire them. Well, the government will subsidize the hiring of these people for some fixed period of time, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And we will expect, of course, that once you've hired them, you will, train them in a way such that they will become attractive employees, people who can actually go out and get a job in the open market without the need of a subsidy down the road. This is not cheap, but it is more affordable than a universal basic income. And it has a very big advantage in my book. It does not create a society that is completely dual, in which some people have formal jobs and live in one kind of world, and in which other people are outside the labor market and live off government transfers. Having a dual society like that brings all kinds of social ills. And I think we should do everything that is within our reach to avoid going down that route.
That's really interesting. Let me push you a bit on that. There's some people who, in developing countries, they say the informal sector is a good thing, and we should, in a sense, encourage it rather than trying to move people as quickly as possible into the formal sector. So informal firms should be encouraged and supported in all sorts of ways rather than formalizing. Do you have a view on that divide, this dual economy, and how a society responds to informality?
I think it is certainly better having people working than having people not working. So if that is the claim, informal work is better than no work at all. But I think the next question one must ask is, why are people working informally? And is that good? Let me begin with the second. It is not good because those people typically will not be saving for retirement. People working in the informal sector will not have access to good health services. People working in the informal sector will not have access to unemployment insurance. And as a result, if they lose their jobs, they have no income, their family has no income. And as they reach 60 or 65, they have nothing to live on. So I don't think we want to be extremist about this. I don't think that government should go out, and fine or round up people who work informally, but we should think about means for formalizing people to the extent that it is possible. And that means, for instance, lowering some of these bureaucratic costs to starting firms in a formal way, and subsidizing, in the way that I just described, formal employment. Let me add one reason, which I think became evident during the pandemic, why informal employment is so terrible. I am speaking to you from the United Kingdom. And as you know, of course, this is a country run by a conservative government. But the fact that they're conservative did not keep them from spending a great deal during the pandemic. And the biggest item of expenditure was what in England is called a furlough, namely an arrangement whereby the government said, Jane Smith in company X has a job, a formal job. Here's a contract. She makes, I'm going to make this up, 24,000 pounds a year. Well, the government is going to pay 75% or 80% of that for the next 6 months, the next 9 months, so that the employment relationship between Jane and the firm is not broken. Why was the British government able to do that? Well, first of all, because it had credible fiscal and monetary institutions, so it could borrow, which is not necessarily the case in many emerging market countries, including yours and mine. I mean, yours and mine are better than most other developing countries, but still we face limits. Secondly, because that employee had a contract, right? Why couldn't South Africa or Chile do that during the pandemic? Chile did a bit of it, or why couldn't Peru or Bolivia or Zimbabwe do it? Well, for a very simple reason, because most people don't have formal contracts. So in times of crisis, in times of crunch, the ability of government to come and help people is severely hindered by the fact that such a large chunk of the economy is informal. And let me give you a last example. I worked advising the finance minister of Peru during the crisis. Peru had very little public debt. They were in a very strong fiscal position. They spent 8 points of GDP fighting the crisis, but it didn't pay off very much. One reason was the following. They couldn't do a furlough scheme of English style, and they decided on cash transfers to poor households. They had a fairly good scheme for identifying the poor households. But then they realized most of those poor households, the heads of households, did not have a bank account. So what happened? They had to be given the cash, quite literally in cash. And to do that, they had to queue up outside banks. Guess what happens when people queue up outside banks in the middle of a pandemic? They get the virus, right? So that was another reason why the absence of formal employment, the absence of formal banking relationships makes it so hard to provide the rudiments of a welfare state. So this is not a conservative argument. This is not a conservative argument. This is a progressive argument. It says if we want a government, if we want a state that is capable of helping people, particularly in difficult situations, we want people to be accessible to that welfare state, whether through a formal banking contract, whether through a formal employment contract, through a formal pensions scheme, so that those people, in fact, will be covered by the safety net. Otherwise, they are not. And we know how much suffering can be brought upon societies like yours and mine, and when people are not covered by a safety net and a big crisis comes.
Very interesting, interesting perspective. I want to move to an article which had a wonderful title that you wrote called Latin America's Monster Movie. And you said that the region has many talents, and one of these is the remarkable ability to misgovern themselves. And part of your examples of this, you argue that from the 70s to the 90s, Latin America missed the boat of export-oriented manufacturing that made East Asia rich. And in the 21st century, it missed the boom in supply chains that benefited countries from Bulgaria to Vietnam. Can you talk to us about this? What did you mean? How did you miss this boat?
Well, there's a lot, packed into that. Let me begin with the title. That I wrote that article in frustration at the very poor performance of Latin American countries when fighting the pandemic. Most Latin American countries are upper middle income. These are not new republics. Most of us have been independent for 200 years. We have reasonably well-functioning governments. Not every country does, but there are pockets of well-functioning governance in each country. And in spite of all of that, we had some of the worst performers when it comes to saving lives. 8 of the 20 countries with the highest deaths per capita are in Latin America, and of course, that's over a third, right? Latin America doesn't account for a third of the countries in the world, and countries like Peru or Brazil or Ecuador are among the top 10. When they spent a lot of money, both Peru and Ecuador, as I mentioned already, spent more than 8 points of GDP fighting the pandemic. So what is it about our countries that, in spite of the fact that we're middle income or upper middle income, in spite of the fact that we've been building some of these governmental institutions for 200 years, why do they work so badly, and why do they make such basic mistakes? One such mistake that you highlighted in the paragraph you quoted has been our inability to diversify exports. As people familiar with the work of Ricardo Hausmann and the Kennedy School team that I used to belong to will know, the diversification of exports is a very good predictor of a country's future growth. If you were trained in economics, you were told that there's something called the theory of comparative advantage, which in an excessively simplified form causes people to think that you should specialize. But in practice, countries don't specialize. Rich countries, the US makes computer and software and artificial intelligence, but they also make furniture and blue jeans and t-shirts. So diversification is the key. And the question is, how do you attain diversification? Once upon a time, 30, 40 years ago, the only way to diversify was to produce a final product. So if you wanted to be a producer of glasses of water, you can't see it. Well, you went into the glass business, you bought some models, you set up a glass factory, and then you shipped that elsewhere. Today, there's another way of doing that. You don't have to make the whole iPhone. You can make the screen of the iPhone and then, or one bit of the transistor in the iPhone, or the keyboard in a computer, and then ship it somewhere. And join the modern world by producing modern goods, modern manufactured goods, without necessarily having to make the whole thing. Most Americans don't know this, but your average American car, presumably made in Detroit, is 40 or 50% made in Mexico. And if you have an iPhone, and if you look at the back of your iPhone, it says assembled in China, designed in California. What it doesn't say is that the iPhone was really made, the components were made in Indonesia and Malaysia and Hong Kong and Taiwan and Thailand and the Philippines and Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are 3 big hubs of assembly of such components. There's 3 big value chains in the world. There's a North American one, where the US is the anchor. There's a European one, where Germany is the anchor. And of course, there's the East Asian one, where China is the anchor. Sub-Saharan Africa and South America are the 2 regions of the world which have been left outside these value chains. And that is very, very, very bad news. And this is not simply a matter of snobbery, of wanting to be part of a club that will not invite us to be members. It is an issue of feasibility, Because as we move up the value chain, as we try to export different products, more sophisticated products, well, it's hard to manufacture brand new products. It is much easier to manufacture bits and pieces. And of course, partially because of geography, we're not in North America, we're not in Europe, we're not in Asia, but also partly because of misguided policies, we are outside these value chains. What can we do about it? Well, I'm not quite sure, but let me give you a couple of thoughts. One is, it is not impossible that for certain items, a country like mine could be within the North American value chain, or a country like yours could be within the European value chain. Not if you're going to produce cement, because cement is very expensive to ship, it's very heavy. But there are lots of other items, whether, your country is 4 hours away by plane or 6 hours away by plane, who cares? It's really very much the same thing. The other thought is that increasingly trade is going to be trade in services, not just trade in goods. The value chains today are mostly about goods, but think of what we're doing right now. We're having a dialogue, you and me, over Zoom. You're in South Africa, I'm in the UK, and there are probably people sitting in mostly in South Africa, but I wouldn't be surprised if somebody joined in from another country of the world. The Zoom revolution is going to allow countries to export services, whether they be professional services, whether they be financial services. And as a result, maybe the way to get around this failure of countries to join value chains is to invent new value chains, which be more linked by service. And I think South Africa is in a pretty good position to do that, as is Chile, because we're middle-income countries with pretty good universities, with reasonably good human capital, with fairly good telecom infrastructure. So I think we're pretty well placed to join those new value chains. But of course, that's going to require a government that wants to make that happen, and firms that want to jump into that particular fray.
True. I'm going to change the subject slightly. You've been critical of politically or financially ambitious academics who live in the West, in northern universities, and in your view, behave irresponsibly in developing countries. What do you mean, and how does this operate exactly? So if you can just talk to us about this. I happen to agree with you, but I'd like to hear your reasons for this assertion.
A generation ago, all over South America, there was a group called the Chicago Boys. The Chicago Boys were, some of them were Latin American, but the initiators were American professors, led by people like Milton Friedman and others, Friedman disciples, who, when lecturing to students at Chicago, were very careful, very scientific. Whenever they said something, they qualified it with lots of ifs and buts. But when they got on a plane and jumped, and traveled to Argentina or Brazil or Mexico or Chile, they left all the ifs and buts behind, all the qualifications, all the subtleties, all the be careful, don't do this, well, don't do it like that. And they became proselytizers of a simplified ideology with lots of commonplaces, with an extreme right-wing view. And that did a lot of harm. It caused a lot of countries to adopt extreme right-wing policies, to believe that everything could be solved by means of the market. And it was bad academic work, it was bad policy advice, and it was bad policy making. Fast forward to the present, and I think we still see some Chicago Boys preaching that particular religion, but the most common site is a different one. The most common site nowadays is the site of left-wing academics from the US or the UK mostly, who are the Chicago Boys in reverse, who in their classrooms in the US, in New York, in London, in Boston, in San Francisco, are serious academics, and they're very careful with the kind of advice that they dispense. But when they go to Johannesburg or to Sao Paulo or to Santiago, they become Chicago Boys of the left. And they repeat cliches, they voice extreme positions, They publish analyses that are very, very heavily slanted toward, their friends in power in country X for country Y. And I think, just as in the case of the Chicago Boys, this does developing countries a massive disservice. Again, it's poor academic research, it's terrible policy advice, and it leads to terrible policymaking. MMT is a perfect example of that. It is true under very qualified circumstances that some countries can exert some revenue generating capacity by money creation. Yes, that is true. But you will notice that, there's the if this, if that, then maybe you can achieve this. But as the academic travels to Johannesburg, all the subtleties and all the ifs and buts are lost. And the recipe is, go off, print money, nothing will happen. And that is not only academically wrong, it is very, very dangerous. So I have no sympathy for this new variety of left-wing Chicago boys. They are doing the developing world a tremendous disservice.
Does that mean that developing countries shouldn't take advice from other, experts in the rest of the world? Or how do developing countries sort of modulate this and make sure they aren't the victims of the new style of left-wing Chicago boys?
Well, I think what we need to do is to exercise critical judgment. Certainly, I've been to South Africa a sufficient number of times to know that there's a highly qualified class of policymakers, academics, economists, political scientists who are in a very good position to separate the nonsense from the useful propositions. I think what happens is that, when Nobel Prize X gets off the plane, there is a temptation to take, whatever, Nobel Prize X says as revealed truth. But believe me, I've been around Nobel Prize winners long enough, either at Harvard or at Columbia or at the LSE, to know that some of the things they say are absolutely brilliant, but not everything that they say is necessarily sound policy advice. It is also very important to realize that somebody who spent his life or her life, but I'll say his life because they're mostly men, writing papers with equations in an office in a very sheltered academic environment, whether that person is the most qualified or not to provide very practical policy advice in which you have to take into account the financial aspects and the economic aspects, but also the political and the social and the cultural. Having some American fresh off the boat or fresh off the plane be the ultimate arbiter of these matters is, I think, pretty unsound. Yes, we should read what they publish, but we should read other people. And then I think we're, in pretty good shape, certainly in South Africa, certainly in Chile, to say, this is good advice, I'll take it. This is mumbo jumbo, I will not take it.
Great. Andrés, you've said that the lessons of the West need not always or necessarily be applicable to the rest, to developing countries. Can you give us one or two examples to illustrate what you mean?
I am not of the school of thought that thinks that there's sort of one economics, one discipline for the rich and one for the poor. A lot of the same principles apply to both. And, I think increasingly as the world has become globalized, as trade has grown, as finance has become more international, it is more so that the principles are the same. But it does not mean necessarily that what is good policy in the UK or the US is necessarily good policy in South Africa or Chile. I'll give you one example. In COVID, now during COVID, the rich countries put together fiscal packages that were 15 or 17 points of GDP, gigantic, okay? And this means that a number of the large rich nations, including the US and the UK, have debt ratios of over 100% of GDP. Is that a good thing? Well, probably it's not a great thing to have debt. It's always better not to have debt. But is it manageable for countries with that kind of economic structure, with that kind of tax regime? It is manageable. And it's particularly manageable in a world like the world we have been living in, where interest rates are very low. However, what is generally true of a country like the US or the UK need not be true in a country like South Africa or Chile. Why? First of all, because we collect a lot less tax than they do. Therefore, public debt of 80 points of GDP is very different if your tax take is 20 points of GDP as opposed to 40 points of GDP. And secondly, because the credibility of fiscal and monetary institutions is very different. Again, South Africa and Chile have done pretty well by the standards of emerging markets. I mean, we have more sophisticated monetary and fiscal institutions, and we have more sophisticated financial markets and more access to markets than most developing countries and most emerging markets. That's a great achievement. But precisely because it is a great achievement, it is a plant that we need to water. It is not a tree whose fruits we can eat indiscriminately. And that means that we need to be careful. When Chile went into the COVID crisis with public debt in around 30 points of GDP, and as a result of all the programs, came out with debt around 40 points of GDP, that's not the end of the world. And I supported the government. The government that was in office in Chile at the time, I had not voted for. It was not my government, but I said, sure, if they're doing a fiscal expansion at the time of crisis, that's perfectly fine. Okay. But at the same time, it was pretty evident that once COVID receded, you needed to undo that fiscal expansion. Because for a country like Chile, 40 points of GDP is manageable as debt. 60 or 70 probably is not. And 100 would be really, really tricky. If I look at Brazil, Brazil is a country where public debt is around 80% of GDP. That recent spike in inflation maybe has eroded that a little bit. And as interest rates rise in the world, that becomes very, very tricky. So yes, the old "don't do this at home" warning that used to come attached with some toys or some ads on TV applies. There are things that rich developed countries can do that the rest of us cannot, at least not yet.
Let me turn to something. I've been using some terms very loosely in our conversation: north, south, the West. Let's look at the concept of the West. The sociologist Peter Berger once wrote a wonderful article with the title, "Where is the West?" demonstrating where that line had moved over the decades. And you wrote a recent article saying, maybe it's time to abandon the concept of the West. Can you explain what you were thinking?
Well, I was thinking that countries should come together in condemning Russian aggression and defending the values of liberty and decency and dignity and democracy. But value and decency and dignity of democracy are not uniquely Western values. They are not necessarily the values of rich countries. They are the values of the world, of decent people all around the planet. So I think the so-called West has made a political mistake and a conceptual mistake in going around in the last month or so to countries like South Africa or India or Indonesia or Turkey, saying, oh, by the way, the West is putting together a coalition to fight Putin's aggression and to support the Ukraine. Join this Western coalition. That makes absolutely no sense, because to invite a country like India with over 1 billion people to, which is a country that is clearly not in the West, to join the Western coalition, first of all, is geographically nonsense, but most fundamentally, India has been a democracy and a thriving democracy since the late 40s. So why not call that that coalition the coalition of democratic countries, the countries that are united in a condemnation of Russian aggression? Japan is supposed to be in the West, and last time I checked, Japan was, in Asia. Australia and New Zealand are supposed to be in the West, and if you live in California, Australia and New Zealand are in the West, but if you live in South Africa, Australia and New Zealand are in the East, right? So clearly, it is time that we change those labels. There is increasingly a potential coalition of like-minded countries, which includes the main democracies of the rich world, whether in North America or in Europe or in parts of Asia like Japan or Korea, or Australia, New Zealand, and like-minded democratic middle-income countries. And I'm thinking here of South Africa and Chile and Brazil and Mexico. Of course, we may have governments of those countries that we like more or less, but that's not the point. The US had Trump. Yes, and Brazil today has Bolsonaro. But Brazil is a thriving democracy, and it belongs in that group. And we also need to make sure that other countries like Turkey, which over the last 20 or 30 years, should have belonged to that group and which have sort of gone to the edge of that group, we need to make sure that they remain within. The same holds true for Poland or for Hungary. And as a result, the label is wrong geographically, but more important, the label is counterproductive politically. I think the time has come to change it.
Great. On this, let me stay with foreign policy for a moment. South Africa is one of those countries that likes to claim that it believes in the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of other countries. So I was intrigued when you wrote an article in the Latin American context saying that this idea of non-intervention in Latin America is actually a myth. Can you tell us a bit about that in the Latin American situation?
Well, let me try to do something risky and answer your question in the context of South Africa. South African Democrats and freedom fighters during the apartheid regime did not believe in non-intervention. They believed that the world's democracies and the decent people of planet Earth should support South Africa in its fight against oppression and apartheid. And as a result, I think instinctively, most South Africans, when confronted with a good cause, would tend to support that good cause, even if that good cause materializes in some other country. To put it more generally, I think there is a strong case to be made along the following lines. There are certain principles that go above and beyond the nation state. Human rights, basic dignity, basic freedoms. And when those basic principles are under attack, when people are being persecuted and tortured and killed, as they were in your country and mine 30 or 40 years ago, it is not simply our business, it is the world's business. And the world should first say something about it and next do something about it. And I think that applies today to the Ukraine. It applies to the issue of human rights in China. It applies to the steps away from liberal democracy that we've seen in countries like Turkey or Hungary or Poland or the Philippines. This is the world's business, and we should not be silent about it.
Let's stay with politics, and I have time for one last big question. The political center is seen by some people as boring, as wishy-washy, basically hard to define, and certainly doesn't have any great songs or memorable slogans.
Yes, exactly.
Yet you argue for this political center and its vital importance, and that the ideas of the center should not just be a kind of combination of ideas from the left and the right. This is really important for South Africa today, where we have to build a democratic center. So let's talk about the importance of the democratic center in politics and your experience of this.
Let me begin by acknowledging that this is not the best time to be a centrist in the world. If you look at recent American elections, or British elections, or if you look at Colombia's elections 2 days ago, it is the case that most elections are polarized, and that candidates of the extreme right and the extreme left do very well. Even in France, which just re-elected a centrist for the presidency 3 weeks ago, this past weekend's elections saw a big surge forward of the far left and the far right. So yes, we centrists, we liberal reformers are struggling. But politics is cyclical, and I think at some point, after a sequence of disastrous left-wing and right-wing governments, of too much ideology, of too much demagoguery, of too much populism, there will be a demand for an adult in the room. That's one way to interpret Joe Biden's arrival to the presidency. You know, he wasn't the youngest or most dynamic or most innovative of leaders, but somebody, you know, but Americans say enough of this madness, enough of this, you know, post-truth crazy world. We want somebody who's sensible. Now, we cannot simply hope, we centrists, we cannot hope that the only way to get into power is that, you know, when voters just get tired of the other guy. We have to have something that we stand for. And I believe that in addition to the commitment to these liberties and these concepts of human dignity that are very central and that you and I were just talking about, there is a policy agenda, which I think is distinctively centrist. You know, we were talking about fiscal affairs. There is a conservative world which thinks that any fiscal deficit is bad at any time. There is an MMT world which thinks that, you know, all fiscal deficits are fine regardless of size or circumstance. Reasonable centrists know that both those positions make no sense. Fiscal policy is not a religious matter, and fiscal policy is a practical matter. And during a pandemic, during a big crisis, there's of course room for a much more aggressive, much more expansionary fiscal policy. But once the pandemic ends, you've got to put your foot on the brake. Think of the other issue that we were just discussing. Yes, there is room for making transfers to low-income households and low-income workers. The right hates that because the right says, oh my God, you know, and on top of the existing government bureaucracy, you're going to spend 5 points of GDP. We can't afford it. And the unthinking left says, yes, of course, you know, spend what we have and more, and don't worry about the financing, don't worry about the design, we'll sort that out later. That is a perfect recipe for a financial crisis 5 years down the road. Is there a centrist position which is bold and distinct? Yes, I think there is. The centrist position says, yes, we want a fairer country. We want opportunities for low-income people. We want to open up doors that today remain closed. We want to do so in a world that avoids a separation of our society into the formal, the informal, the ones with high quality jobs and the ones with no jobs. And therefore, we want to design these transfers very well. We want to link them to formal employment or to quasi-formal employment, and we want to pay for them in a way that is sustainable. The worst thing that you can do is to provide benefits today that you're not sure you can pay for tomorrow. If there's one recipe for frustration with politics and democracy, is to announce with great pomp and circumstance a brand new program, which 3 years later has to be thrown out the window because the country is in the middle of a financial crisis. In Latin America, we have 200 years of experience with that. It does not work. So yes, I think it is incumbent upon many of us, and I think your center, Ann, in South Africa does a bit of this. I try to do a bit of this here at the LSE. It is incumbent upon many of us to try to elucidate what this distinctive, progressive, and bold set of centrist ideas are. You know, if we centrists allow ourselves to be, you know, sort of shoved in a corner as the boring types, then, you know, we will always keep losing elections. But I'm absolutely sure this is a distinctive policy agenda. I'm also sure that it's a better agenda than that which the extremes are peddling and which is failing so miserably in so many countries today.
Well, Andrés, that's a wonderful note on which to end. I'm sure you've got some votes this evening from our audience, but thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating. I think it underlines yet again something I've believed for a long time, that developing countries, middle-income developing countries, can learn a lot from each other and their common experience. And it's been fantastic listening to you tonight. So thank you very much. We've come to the end of our hour. Thank you for joining us, everybody. We will be writing this up and sending it out. And this has been really fascinating. Andrés,
thank you, Ann. Thanks everybody who joined. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Great. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.